its needles and slow growth and cause stress. So that's what we're focusing on. And I'm going to start this talk. The general theme I went with here is younger stands. So there are some bark beetles and things that affect larger trees. So think bigger diameter, more mature canopy trees. So I might not be talking about things you might be familiar with like Douglas fir beetle. But again, we're here to give you assistance as things come up and you need more information, you know how to find us. So something that we've all been dealing with recently is drought. So I'm going to start by talking about that. And it's something that can affect all different kinds of tree species and plants, really. So what is drought? Simply speaking, a lack of water, but you knew that. And but for trees, that there are other factors that determine how that drought or lack of water affects them and whether or not they can recover from that damage or whether or not it might lead to some permanent damage or mortality. So here's a nice long list for you of all the factors that I could think of that would affect how a tree might respond to drought. And most of them are things that you're not going to have any control over. So environmental factors that come and go. Some of them, you know, it depends on where your property sits. So for example, you know, a ridge top might be, you know, have more water draining away from it and have more drought potential than down in a valley where the water's draining too. So the bottom 5 there with the red arrows, these are things that you may have control over as you're managing your stand or planning a stand for planting and what you're going to plant and where you're going to plant it and how much you're going to plant. So the big one is competition. So the trees are competing for water, nutrients, they're competing for light. And so obviously the biggest issue with competition and drought is water. And so you want to make sure to give your trees room to grow. The soil type, you don't have any control over changing that soil type. So let's say you have a rocky soil that's really well drained, more droughty, but you do have some control over what you might plant on those types of soils. So then that leads to the next one, which is tree species. This is a big one. So not only are you planting the tree in the right site, but you're planting the right tree for that site. So droughtier sites, you want to plant trees that are more drought tolerant. And then the tree size, you may not think that's something you can control either, because if you have a property, you know, you've got 20-year-old trees on it, that's not going to change really much in the near future. But over time, it will, and you can just be aware of the factors with tree size and how that might impact your trees. So the smaller trees, they have shallower root systems, so it's harder for them to get to that deeper water. And also they have less leaf area than the bigger trees. And so when you have a weather event that comes along and damages all the new foliage that's more succulent, then that's just going to be a higher percentage of the whole tree's foliage that's affected. And then the last one, again, you don't have a ton of control over what's flying around insect wise. And if you have root disease fungi in the soil, you're not going to be able to remove those or anything. But what you can do is keep in mind that when you have a lot of dead material, and I'm talking about things that have died within the last year. So trees you've cut down and left lying out there, trees that have blown over, those can be a source, or even like bigger branches that you've been pruning off, they can be a source of insects. So large amounts of storm damage, for example, can produce larger populations of bark beetles, which then have the potential to move from that dead material they're breeding in into your live trees. This is more of a concern for Eastern Washington than Western Washington, but it's something to keep in mind during drought periods. And so just to reemphasize the history of this, from 2000 to 2020 is not showing on here, but you can see that this top chart is showing the percentage of the state that's experiencing some level of drought. The yellow color is less severe than the red. So in this 2001 season, the 100% of the state was experiencing some kind of drought, but very little in the severe category. And you can see that every year in the summer, we experience some kind of drought, even right here where it was barely anything in 2011. So our trees are used to having a summer drought. They can handle that. But when it gets into this really severe or really extended period, like what happened in 2015, which was a very unusual event where you had 100% of the state in drought, but over 60% of the state in a severe drought category for several months. And you can see that in this map from summer of 2015. And we are still seeing the effects of that 2015 event today, because it can kind of permanently weaken some of these trees, and it takes them a long time to recover. And that makes them more susceptible to fungi like root diseases and attacks from bark beetles. But also keep in mind that those bark beetles and the fungi, since they're being more successful, they're building up bigger populations, and it takes them time to do that. And so we're seeing just higher levels of the things that are trying to attack your trees and lower levels of tree vigor, lower levels of tree defenses. And 2020 was another drought year, but again, nowhere near the high level across the whole state. So what to look for drought by itself, so not even looking at any insects or fungi, can cause damage to trees. And the pattern you might look for is that more than one species is affected. So in this photo, you could see you've got Douglas fir and ponderosa pine on the left there. They both have this kind of brown color in the new foliage. That tree in the center seems to be less affected. And this has probably to do with some of that microsite effect. That particular tree is in a little bit better soil, maybe deeper roots. Maybe it's just generally more vigorous, because you can see it has a lot more foliage to begin with. So multiple species, we tend to see the worst effects of this on the marginal sites, so the well-drained soils, and those kind of exposed southern facing slopes, that kind of thing. And then the damage develops kind of from the top down and the outside in of the tree crown. So the live branches, we see the damage first in the new foliage, which makes sense because that's the farthest distance a tree has to move water. And that foliage is, the newer foliage is the most active in terms of exchanging gases, so that they can photosynthesize and create food for themselves. They have to lose water as part of that process. When they're pulling in carbon dioxide and letting out oxygen, they're losing water. And so when we get super high temperatures, really hot, dry winds, it pulls a lot of that water out of the new needles or leaves. And so you start to see these effects more on the tips. And then as it gets worse, you start seeing dead tops. And again, that top is primarily new foliage. And then this thing we call flagging, where you have individual branches that start turning red or orange, like in the left photo there. So you see this kind of damage. You want to know what it is. It's pretty hard to sample that high up in a tree, but you might find a tree like this little one on the left here that's completely dead, and you can sample that tree without harming it, remove some of the bark, and looking for beetles. And you might find, like in this photo on the right, that there's nothing in there. There's no beetle tunnels or holes or sap pouring out of there. And so that can be kind of a clue that the tree has died from something like drought or flooding that has killed the roots or tissues, and the insects didn't really have time to respond, or they actually didn't find that tree attractive because it was just too dry. So what these these beetles that attack drought stressed trees or flood damaged trees or a wind thrown tree lying on the ground, what they're trying to do is get in there and lay their eggs in there. And their larvae or grubs, when they hatch out of the eggs, are feeding on the sugar that the tree has produced. The sugar's underneath the bark. So between essentially the white wood that you would build things out of and the bark, there's this layer in between there called the phloem or inner bark that moves the sugar. And so these little baby bark beetles, this tunnel here is made by the adult female, and she's laying eggs along there, and all these hundreds of eggs hatch out, and they mine tunnels away from this egg gallery. And so when they do that in a live tree, they're cutting off the flow of that sugar that the tree needs. And if you get enough of these tunnels, it can actually kill the tree. And so they need to have a certain, in order for the beetles to be successful, there has to be a certain level of moisture and a certain level of sugar available to them. And so when you see these galleries, especially these days, it's not always a safe assumption that the beetles killed the tree. It may be that something else has damaged the tree, like a root disease, flood, drought, and construction damage, you name it. There's all kinds of different things that could have happened to the tree. And so we often call these secondary bark beetles. There are larger beetle larvae, like on the right here, called wood borers, that are essentially doing something similar, except they almost exclusively attack dead and dying trees. So they're secondary to something else. They're not a primary tree killer. So there's quite a bit of variety in these secondary bark beetles. You can find them in almost any tree species. So here are some examples of recent kind of drought-related damage we've seen in Doug fir, western hemlock in the center top there, the pines, and then the western red cedar on the lower left. The hemlock, as you can see in this photo, doesn't have any foliage or needles on it. And so they often go undetected when they're dying off, because they immediately, as soon as they dry out and die, drop their needles. And so you don't get this flash of red or orange that really clues you into a problem there. And some of these, sorry, I didn't mention on the title there, some of these symptoms don't appear until the year or 2 years even after the drought event. So it can be challenging to link back. And these kind of symptoms from drought are a little bit more intuitive that you might think of with other kinds of plants like wilting. I very rarely have ever witnessed the wilting in a conifer like this. It's almost, by the time you come and see it, it's turned brown or this kind of bleached white color like that center photo. And even more often, by the time you find it, the needles have fallen off. Other things to look for that can be related to drought, but other things as well. Stress cone crop, photo on the right. When a conifer is dying, its instinct, so to speak, is to reproduce itself. And so it will put on a lot more cones than might be normal. And then another thing we can see, especially in young trees, in like plantations, is this kind of sunburn effect on the bark, where you might get a lot higher temperatures and maybe more exposure to the sun, but also drought, which causes a damage to that tender bark that can't keep the moisture in. And then we get fungi that come in again as secondaries, like this Phomopsis fungus that causes a canker around this sort of sunken bark damage here. So there are lots of things that you will pick up and see on these trees, the actual fungi themselves, the actual insects themselves. But it's really important to, after you've identified or had someone help you what that thing is, then ask the next question, which is, why is it there? Okay, so I'm going to go through some specific tree types that you may be interested in, and the kinds of major pests in smaller trees that might be an issue with these trees. So we'll start with Douglas fir. And I mentioned these secondary bark beetles. So these are just some of the specific ones that you might find in Douglas fir. I showed a couple pictures earlier of these, the egg galleries and the larval galleries. So the bottom right there, just to give you an indication of what these look like, these two species, the pole beetle and the Douglas fir engraver, leave a very similar gallery. There's a third species that doesn't even have a common name. We'll just call it another engraver. And they're called engravers because they're etching their tunnel into the sapwood, and they leave kind of a deep groove there. So the key with these is smaller trees, smaller branches. That's what they like. And then that gallery, the egg gallery, is going to be a fairly short length. So a couple inches to maybe 6 inches max. Whereas like a Douglas fir beetle, which is a more primary tree killing pest of larger Douglas fir, say over 10 or 12 inch diameter, those galleries are going to be much longer, like a foot or more. And if you want to see these galleries, literally just walk around in the woods and pick up any old Doug fir branches lying on the ground, and you'll almost always find these little galleries in there. So normally they're not a big deal. They maintain low levels. They're just breeding in that, the dead branches and pruning slash and stuff like that from logging, and they stay at low populations. They rarely go and attack healthy live trees. But when we get drought events and you get a massive amount of this kind of slash or recently killed trees, then the combination of drought and a big beetle population can cause some more of that top kill and branch dieback. But if you have a stand like the one in the lower right, that's, there's a lot of competition in there, and you see some of these smaller trees are dying because they get no sun, you shouldn't be surprised to see these bark beetles active in there, or root diseases as well. And speaking of which, so the root diseases affect all kinds of different trees, and I put this under Douglas fir just because I think it tends to be one of the most common tree species we see issues with root disease. And so I just put it here, but keep in mind that you can have these in any kind of tree, including hardwoods or broadleaf trees. So things to look for with root disease, this photo on the upper right is great because you have an old stump there that may have originally had the fungus that causes the root disease. So these fungi are underground and they're parasitic. They are stealing the sugars from the tree roots. And as they're doing that, trying to get their free lunch, they are putting enzymes into the roots themselves to get that sugar, but that causes a decay. And so you can see on the bottom right, eventually these roots start to fall apart. The finer, hair-like parts of the roots that are new growth die back, and the tree either dies in place or falls over when the wind comes along because it doesn't have any stability. So looking closer in this upper right photo, so you have that old stump, let's assume that had the fungus originally, and then these new trees either grew in or were planted. You've got one here in the foreground that's already completely dead. And then this one here has this yellow-green color to it. And it's also the amount of growth that it's putting on every year seems to be getting shorter. And so that could be a sign, the yellowing, that it's not getting nutrients like nitrogen or say fertilizer from the soil because its roots aren't functioning. And that reduced shoot growth, obviously, if your roots aren't functioning, you can't grow very fast or very tall. So one thing you can do to diagnose this is you can uproot a smaller dead tree like this and examine what's going on under the soil. You can look for these sorry, this is kind of a bad photo, but these exposed roots that somebody dug up here are covered with a white, we call it a mycelium, which is kind of like a mold essentially growing on the roots. And that's the root disease fungus itself. But if you can't do that, another thing you can do is just keep an eye out for trees that have fallen over and look at their root systems. And if they're highly decayed, like the one on the right, you might suspect root disease. And you can actually identify which root disease it is by looking at the root bark and the decay pattern. So one of the big ones with Douglas fir is laminated root rot. And the decay pattern, if you pulled out some wood from the root area or even an old stump, you're looking edge on at the annual rings here, and the fungus decays between the annual rings, and so they start to separate. And that's kind of this laminated term describing that as if like pages of a book pulling apart. And in there you might see these brown or red, it almost looks like a stain. This is highly magnified here, of what we call, some people call them red whiskers. They're also more technically known as sedal hyphae, and that's the fungus itself. And they're called this red whiskers because they're about the length of, say, like a week-long beard growth. And they're very distinctive for this disease. You can't find these in any other kind of root disease. And then also this, I mentioned this white mold pattern on the outside of the bark. That's the mycelium again. For laminated, it grows on the outside of the bark. So you can see that with this disease, the pines are seldom damaged, and hardwoods like alder and maple and western red cedar are resistant. So this is one where you can, choose a different tree species to kind of adapt to having this on your trees. Armillaria is one that has pretty much every tree species is a host to this. So there aren't a lot of options for other things you can plant that won't get this. And with this one, the mycelia, again, this kind of white mold mat, it grows under the bark. So this tree on the right, the bark has been removed, and the fungus is actually grown up above the soil surface into the base of the tree stem. And those are pretty distinctive. They have a fan shape. They peel off easily, like in this picture in the upper left. And they also make these black kind of root-like structures in the decayed wood. Some people call this the shoestring fungus. And it also makes mushrooms that pop up out of the ground in big bunches. They're kind of an amber brown color. And so this armillaria, I put on here opportunist, okay? And that's something that we see a lot in young kind of plantations where there's a lot more trees than that site will support. And you're kind of looking for, you're planting a lot of extra trees. Say you're expecting a drought, for example, and some of these trees are going to die. And if you plant a lot, then you have an opportunity to kind of thin it out at some point. And maybe you're allowing nature to pick some of the weaker trees for you. So it'll make your thinning decisions easier. Well, this armillaria is one of the things that will often be seen in those competition stressed trees. And then after you've gone through and done a thinning and kind of reduced the competition, then the trees you left behind, even though this fungus is still there, they don't get infected by it. And if they do, they're fighting it off successfully because they're healthy. So having a root disease or seeing it in a dead tree is not necessarily major 3-alarm fire, as long as the trees that it seems to be affecting are those that you knew were already weak or what we call suppressed trees. They're not very tall, they're not getting much sunlight, and they're not growing. And so to have a root disease in those isn't a huge surprise. doesn't mean it's going to spread to your healthier, bigger trees. I'm just going to mention this one kind of in passing because it's not very common, but it is another thing that's in young Douglas fir in some areas. It's another root fungus, and it causes this black staining. It's got a pretty good name for that, black stain root disease. And it's real distinctive because that black stain, if you cut a piece of the root in cross section, you can see the black staining kind of follows the arc of the annual rings there. And it's vectored or moved from tree to tree by these root feeding beetles. So here's a little tiny bark beetle, like the size of a grain of rice, and a couple of weevils with their big long noses here that live underground, and they feed on roots, and they, whether intentionally or not, spread this fungus around between Douglas fir. Okay, so total gear switch, another fungus, but this one's above ground and affecting the needles. So in the Olympic Peninsula and anywhere along the Washington coast, this is kind of a big deal. Its only host is Douglas fir. The name Swiss needlecast, it sounds like it's one invasive from Europe, but in fact, it's a native disease. It got its name because people growing Douglas fir in Switzerland noticed a lot of this disease occurring. And so it's non-native to Europe, essentially, from us. And so native disease, and it causes this kind of browning and yellowing you can see in the upper left there. And it gets its name needle cast because the needles that are infected right here, these 2-year-old needles are kind of brown and they're covered with this black fungus on the underside. The next year they fall off, and so they're cast from the tree. And of course, the new foliage is not infected yet. That's just expanding there, but this fungus makes spores that are flying around in the air everywhere. And so that new foliage will probably get infected. It needs moisture to grow really well on the needles. And so we tend to see the effects worsening, after we have heavy rainfalls in the spring time when this is making more spores, they're more successful. Also in more dense stands. So in the upper left there, the fog, the daily moisture that comes through evaporating from the ground, there's not a lot of airflow through these dense stands. And so that moisture doesn't really have a chance to clear out. So one thing that people might do with this disease is a little bit of thinning or pruning to get more airflow going through, but you're just lessening the effects, but not getting rid of the fungus. So the reason this is so bad on the coast with Douglas fir is because Douglas fir naturally doesn't grow really close to the coast. We've been planting it there because it's more valuable. What tends to grow more naturally on the coast sites is hemlock and Sitka spruce. And so they don't get this disease. And the further inland you go with Douglas fir, the less often you're going to see this kind of damage. So it's one of those things that can also be managed by choosing where to plant certain types of trees. So here's a picture of what that Swiss needlecast damage looks like from the air. It can get pretty severe some years, cause a lot of browning. In young, these are more like seedling, sapling size Douglas fir. Again, you get this little top kill pattern or branch flagging, dead tips. Of course, there's a lot of different things that could cause that, like drought. So it's important to take a close look when you see this kind of damage to look for any kind of fungus, like those black, these black fruiting bodies on the needles, or chewing from like a caterpillar, for example. Or in the case of this weevil, looking for little holes where these beetles have exited the tree, or little globs of pitch where they've been going in to feed. And so there's a little larva of this cute little weevil that's actually kind of destructive, and that larva is feeding in the pith, the center of that twig, causing that tip kill, and then eventually that new adult comes out of the tree and leaves a very tiny little hole as it leaves. So sometimes, this comes with drought, but it also comes with poorly planted trees. Like you can see this tree in the upper here, it's basically looks like it's growing almost in a driveway. Those are the kind of trees that might be more stressed or susceptible to this guy. So that's Douglas fir twig weevil. This is one that I get reports of every spring. So I kind of threw it in there just so you're aware of it, or if you've seen it and wondered what it was. It's a caterpillar. It's awful lot like a tent caterpillar, except that it's doing this on conifers instead of on alders or cottonwoods, hardwoods that tent caterpillars attack. So it creates this webbing like tents, and it can look really nasty. And I guess it's pretty bad this year in some places. Notice, though, that it doesn't feed on the new growth at the tip of the branch here. And so the buds aren't damaged. Last year's needles usually aren't damaged. And so it looks really bad, but the tree is going to recover from that and continue to grow. And these caterpillars have a lot of natural enemies. So there's parasitic wasps and things like that kill off the population after, you see damage for a year or two, and then it basically goes away. It comes back maybe 7 or 10 years later. And another thing that's weird about these is the caterpillars are active in the winter, like late winter, early spring. And so you get big, some people call these woolly bears, these orange black caterpillars. You see them, bigger caterpillars, when you think it might be too cold for them. Okay, grand fir. So not a super common Western Washington tree, but depending on where you are, you might have a lot of it. And this is another bark beetle that, it's doing the same thing I talked about, trying to get under the bark. And that's where you see this pitch streaming in the upper right, where they're trying to attack going into the tree. This tends to be more of a pest of larger diameter fir trees, but I threw it in here because it can also act as a secondary in small trees. It makes this horizontal egg gallery. See, there's an adult right there, female again. So if the tree was standing and you're looking at the stem here, you cut the bark off, instead of having the egg gallery go up and down like those others I was showing you, it goes across the grain. And then the larvae mine up and down from there. So that's a real distinctive gallery pattern that helps you identify this. If you see that across the grain gallery in hemlock or silver fir, then it might be something called silver fir beetle, which is really closely related to this. And actually, now that I've said that, it is in a different genus. This one is, if you see the adults, they're pretty distinctive because it looks like their rear end. So this is the head here. The rear end is underneath the wing covers is basically gone there, like something took a bite out of it. Whereas some of these other beetles, bark beetles I've shown you, they have kind of a rounded rear end. Okay, I seem to be stuck in the laser pointer. There we go. So sometimes it can get into trees without killing them. So again, I mentioned branches and tops. So this can get in smaller trees as well. Cause a top kill, scatter dead branches, and sometimes the trees can live through that attack. That example in the bottom right is kind of cool. It's a place in the grand fir where these beetles had attacked and laid eggs, and maybe they were successful in that one section, but there weren't enough of them to kill the tree. And so it grew, new sapwood over that wound and eventually covered it up. So we're seeing an uptick in this fir engraver activity since that 2015 drought. We've gotten more reports of issues with this in Western Washington. This is one of the, I think one of the few that I'm going to talk about that's not native to Washington. It's called the balsam woolly adelgid, which is kind of fun to say. Adelgid is a relative of aphids, but they only attack conifers. And so like an aphid, it's a sucking insect, sucking the sap. And so this little guy here kind of looks like an aphid, but it's got this really long drinking straw essentially for mouth part. And they drill that down into the sapwood. And when they're doing that, you wouldn't think these little cotton balls all over the stem of a fir tree, like a grand fir, that you wouldn't think these tiny little, there's an insect in each one of those cotton balls, just sitting in place, sucking there. Think about like a scale insect you might be familiar with. You wouldn't think they'd do much damage, but if there's enough of them and they inject this, essentially a toxic saliva into the tree. And our native fir trees are, I'm just going to skip past this. I'll come back to it. Our native fir trees are not adapted to defend against this because it's from Europe. And in Europe, the firs that grow there can deal with it, but ours cannot. And so it causes this, like I said, a toxin. It causes staining in the sapwood. And so after about 5 or 10 years of feeding, a tree can actually die from this. Other symptoms are swelling, this abnormal swelling in the branch tips, call it gouting, almost like knuckles. And then the tree crown starts to kind of collapse in a little bit and get smaller. You're not getting a lot of good growth. You might be familiar with some of the other adelgids you've seen out there. This one is on Douglas fir. It's called the Cooley spruce gall adelgid. It's also on spruce, like a Sitka spruce. It makes these big pine cone looking galls at the tips of spruce trees. Does not do that on a Doug fir. It alternates between fir and spruce. It has this weird different generation cycle. It has to have those two different hosts. But on Douglas fir, sometimes it gets bad enough that it looks like the tree's almost been snowed on. But they're generally, unless you're trying to sell Christmas trees, generally harmless. And then the one on the right there, the hemlock woolly adelgid, we have that in the Pacific Northwest, but it's not a major pest here. Back east, though, on eastern hemlock, it's a real tree killer. It's an invasive, but our Western Washington trees seem to be okay with it. We do have a lot of predators that control those adelgids. And Sitka spruce, I've already mentioned the spruce gall, the tips at the ends there. It's another one of those things that looks bad, but not really serious in terms of long-term damage. So while we're on the theme of sucking insects, I'll talk about this spruce aphid. On the coast in 2019, if you spend any time around like ocean shores, Willapa Bay, pretty much anywhere around that area further north, I think, the Sitka spruce had this horrible brown color. It was worse in the older foliage. So this photo on the lower left there kind of looks like that, but the new buds here hadn't flushed out yet. And so right around that March, April timeframe, it looked really bad. And then the new foliage came out kind of like in that picture on the right, and they looked a little better. You couple that with the drought effect that the spruce were experiencing, it really was kind of a perfect storm where these trees looked rather bad. So it's another non-native from Europe. And this is a little aphid that crawls around. It's this bright green color, easy to see. But it's active during the winter, kind of like that tiger moth caterpillar I talked to you about. And so normally our winters are cool enough that we don't see issues with this. But every once in a while you get a mild, warmer winter, and that just allows more of them to survive. And they go to town at that point. And so the last big outbreak of spruce aphid, I think it was around 20. Okay, I'm not going to say the year because I can't remember exactly. But you can see the weather pattern was similar for the 2019 outbreak. The good thing with this is that since the buds and the new foliage aren't damaged, the trees will tend to recover. And so if you go through these areas that were affected in 2019, it's really hard to tell, that it didn't even been there, except they're missing some of the older foliage. So some stress, some growth loss, but you add drought to that, you get big problems. Okay, and so also Sitka spruce, we have the white pine weevil, which is kind of a goofy name for an insect that affects spruce. But it's the same species that affects white pine. And so that's the name that sticks now. What it does, it's another weevil, kind of like that Douglas fir twig weevil I talked about. The larvae are mining under the bark and they kill the top, and they keep coming back year after year and attacking the same tree. And so what happens is that those side branches below the dead top will take over as a new leader, and then they get attacked, and you get this pattern over time of kind of like a bush, essentially, instead of a nice straight growing Sitka spruce tree. So they like high temperatures, fast growing leaders that, they want that succulent tissue to feed on. And so the spruce that grow further inland, this is kind of the opposite of the Swiss needlecast issue, where those drier, hotter sites farther from the coast, the spruce don't do as well because of this weevil. You get closer to the coast, you get more fog banks and more shading, then the leaders grow slower, and so less issue with the weevil. They like younger trees, but once they get to be about 20, 25 years old, 40, 50 feet high, they just naturally stop attacking those trees. So eventually, even though it looks horrible, these trees will grow out of it. And this is just kind of an old study, a map showing you where the lower risk for weeviling is pretty close to the coast, the very low risk. And then this darker gray area is low risk. And you even get to go up in the river valleys here because there's more fog in those. But anywhere further inland, you see more weeviling attacks. So how would you manage this if you've got Sitka spruce? Preferentially planting different trees if you're further from the coast, if you can. If you're going to grow spruce further from the coast, you might want to do denser plantings. Delay your thinning activities so that those leaders don't grow very fast. You can plant alders in with the stand to create some kind of natural shading to slow the trees down. I think this weevil resistant seedling is, you used to be able to buy those. I don't know how widely they're available. But if you're interested, let me know and I can try and track that down. Okay, so I can see I got about 10 minutes left, and I was going to save 5 minutes at the end for questions, but I don't see anything in the chat box. If I'm wrong, let me know. So I'm just going to see if I can get a little further into these with the 10 minutes we have left. So shore pine, which is also a lodgepole, but grows in Western Washington and around areas closer to the coast. one thing that we see all the time in shore pines, get a lot of questions about, because they're kind of obviously, they look bad and it looks like the tree might be in trouble here. These big sort of golf ball, baseball sized globs of pitch, and they just keep getting bigger every year. And they're created by these caterpillars of a pitch moth, they're called. And sometimes you see them in spruce and Douglas fir, but most common is in pines. And the main impacts, you got a wound there. It's not serious. It's not going to kill the tree, but the wound doesn't close. It can contribute to kind of a weaker area there, and perhaps a place for fungi to get in to decay in the wood. If you dig into one of these pitch globs, like here in the lower left, you might see the little caterpillar inside. And it's just feeding on the tree tissue. It stays in that spot. And then when it turns into an adult, it's this really interesting looking, this is a moth, believe it or not. It's a clear wing moth. And it's a mimic, as you can see, of like a yellow jacket or some other kind of wasp or hornet, as a defense mechanism, probably to keep things from eating it because it looks dangerous. So that moth, if it's a female, when she mates, she'll come back to the same spot where she was born and lay new eggs in there. And so that's why these pitch globs just keep getting bigger and bigger. And so one thing, I don't have that in the slides here. Oh, wait, I do, bottom right. Really important with this, if you're pruning, especially in pines, you want to be doing that in the fall or late summer when these things aren't flying, because they like to attack those pruning wounds around, branch stobs. Something that looks kind of like that is this red turpentine beetle, a similar kind of pitch glob, but these are going to be more isolated to the lower part of the tree near the ground. They're not going to be associated with branches that have broken or been pruned off. And they have this kind of grainy texture. You can see a bunch, it almost looks like grape nuts cereal piled up on the soil there. And this is just another bark beetle that's feeding. They tend to feed in groups in one area. That's why they produce so much pitch. It's not usually lethal unless you've got some other problems with your tree. But I'm just putting that in there so you know what the heck it is. And another one, so you know what the heck it is, are these Ips pine engravers. So there's that word engraver again, and you can see this egg gallery is really unique. It's like a fork shape and etched into the wood. These are really a serious problem in Eastern Washington, but they do occur in Western Washington, and usually they don't attack live trees and kill them unless those trees are declining from something else. So I've seen these in lodgepole or shore pine that are dying from drought and other things. So just recognize what that might be. They make these piles of red, almost like a sawdust or boring dust when they go into a tree on the ground. That's their preference, but they'll also attack weak trees. And their rear end, so again, head of the bark beetle here, we're talking grain of rice size. The rear end is also distinctive. It has these spines sticking out from the back. And again, in shore pine or lodgepole, there's this needle sheath miner. It's another caterpillar, turns into a moth, a very tiny little gray moth here on the end of the needle. It makes webbing, and it chews at the base of the needles. And so the needles tend to break, but the webbing keeps them on the tree. And so you get this mass of long pine needles that are kind of hung up in there, and then they turn brown. And when these have outbreaks, it can look pretty horrible. It looks like the trees are dead. But it's always important to kind of go and look at the older foliage, look at the buds. If there's any other part of the tree that's still alive, that doesn't necessarily mean it's dying. So they have, kind of like the tiger moth, they have a lot of natural enemies. So you get this explosion in population, and then they die back. Okay, so Western red cedar, real quick, something you might see is a fungus, is a leaf blight that, it's kind of like that Swiss needle cast in the Douglas fir. It makes these brown or black spots on the scales of the cedar. And that can cause a browning effect. You can see there, it's not necessarily, going to lead to tree mortality, growth reduction, stress, and will tend to get worse in those moist years. So hopefully you're seeing a theme here. Here's another one that we get a lot of reports about that's kind of like a weather related thing, or really more seasonal. And it can be more pronounced with drought. And that's this sort of seasonal flagging of older foliage in cedars, and sometimes we see it in pine, where in the late season, fall time, the tree is almost preparing to shed older foliage it doesn't need anymore, and so it turns brown, and that can look pretty alarming. But again, nothing to worry about. And this is the other cedar issue in young trees that if we were all in a room together, you could guess out loud. But I'll give it away, because look at the pattern of damage just in the lower part of a 10-foot tall tree. It's deer or other animals browsing, which is a major issue with cedar, as you probably already know if you've been trying to grow young cedar. And unfortunately, I think I'm out of time. The last piece of this talk is about broadleaf trees, and I was going to talk about defoliators. And so with the minute or two I have left, just to point out that with deciduous trees, they're used to putting on new leaves every spring anyway. And so having that damage can be bad for that first year, but they have the energy and ability to recover and put on new growth afterwards. And so a lot of these, like with the tent caterpillars, have a lot of natural enemies. And so you get these big blowups in population, damage looks really bad, but then the natural enemies like parasites and predators knock the population of caterpillars down, trees recover. And then you get this kind of cycle. So the natural enemies population goes down, then the caterpillars are allowed to come back up. And so every 7 to 10 years, we have this outbreak of tent caterpillars. And there's a whole bunch of different little critters that are similar to this. Here's an example that's actually a beetle larva. So if you're seeing, dieback where you see evidence of chewing, webbing in your hardwoods, that's probably something that's not going to be severe long-term. If you're seeing more kind of like dieback and branches that aren't recovering after the damage, then you might start thinking about something that's a little more serious, like cankers or root diseases that are causing an actual, dieback or decline. An example of that is what we've been seeing in big leaf maple in Western Washington, kind of branch flagging, branch dieback, whole trees dying from what we think is basically a drought-related dieback of maples. Okay, so I think I've reached the end of my time here, and I got a message to keep going so that we have a recording. So if you need to sign off, please feel free to do so, and I'll carry on for the recording. So this leaf beetle, these little black, they're not caterpillars, they're beetle larvae, but they look a lot like caterpillars or worms. They're what we call a skeletonizer. And so you can see pretty clearly there, they're feeding between the leaf veins. And so they have a real distinctive damage pattern. And that one was a couple years ago, if you had alders, you might have noticed a big explosion in these. And then when the adult beetles develop, there are these really cool looking shiny blue or shiny green metallic beetles, but they do like to fly into your house. So I had them all over in my house. Got a couple alders in the yard. And here's that big leaf maple I was talking about. Some pictures just show you what that looked like. If you've had some maple damage on your property, you may already know about this. And it causes, besides the branch dieback and top kill, in the early stages, it causes this kind of burning at the tips of the leaves. And another symptom is when you get new leaves coming out in the spring, they're a smaller size. And so the tree is running out of resources in order to maintain those larger leaves. And again, thinking about drought, losing tissue at the tips could be drought related, but there's also another little sucking insect called a leaf hopper that can cause this kind of damage. And we did see leaf hoppers in some of the plots that were sampled for this, but really no smoking gun. They tested the root samples for different kinds of root diseases and things like anthracnose, and found a little bit of everything, but there was no common denominator. So a University of Washington study looking more broadly at this at a lot of different plots through Western Washington basically came to the conclusion that this was related to more extreme droughts. And then along with those droughts, we had higher temperatures in the summer. You all remember those 90 plus degree days that we had, record numbers of those days for some of the more recent summers. And also, trees growing near human developments, changes in stand pattern may have impacted this as well. So hopefully with better moisture, lessening drought problems, we may see an improvement in some of these. And then I think this is my last picture to leave you with. Hopefully you got a talk about wildlife and how great that is. And so this is one of those wonderful little woodpeckers that I put it under the broadleaf because I think it seems to be much more common in deciduous or broadleaf trees, especially like willows and alders and maples, is these little holes made by the sapsucker. They don't go very deep. And as you can see, if you're not already familiar with this, they're always in a neat little row, up or down or side to side. These do occur in conifers. And they can cause tree stress. You can see a lot of sap weeping out of there, but rarely lead to mortality. And I kind of put this in my talk because it's wildlife, but it's also people who aren't familiar with these birds and what they do will sometimes think that these are beetles that have been coming out of the tree, leaving exit holes. And those larger wood borers do leave holes that are about this size and shape, but they wouldn't be quite that numerous, and certainly not in neat rows. So yes, that's the end of the show. Thanks for hanging out if you did. And for those of you listening to the recording, hopefully it wasn't more than an hour.
Glenn, that was fantastic. I'm really glad we have a recording of that because that was a ton of information, and the pictures and the descriptions were super helpful. So thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to share that information with us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome. And let's see, your contact information, I believe was that on the first slide of the presentation? Mm-hmm. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so for the folks that are joining us, if you have follow-up questions for Glenn, you will have his email in that recording link, and we will make that recording available in the next few days. So yeah, thanks everybody, and thank you again, Glenn.
Yep, you're very welcome. Have a great day.
Thank you. Take care.